Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. The topic of this episode is a technical one, and one that I'm going to split into two parts: information and demonstration. It's something to go over and understand before you start writing. It's also based on a request that I've gotten, not through the comments section, but privately. Too many authors don't pay attention to this, and it ends up showing in their work. What is that aspect? The proper format of any prose story. And in this case, proper refers to industry or traditional publishing standards. Now, nonfiction and poetry have their own distinctive styles, but pretty much all of prose, all of fiction, shares the same base style. You might see some variation within genres, but overall, there is a foundational conformity, aka a standard format. Now, before we get into things, I do want to mention something. I said there were variations from genre to genre, but there's a few others as well. One of those being a submission version. There are also places where a personal variation is possible, and we will cover all of those, including some standard points that the majority of publishers use for their submissions. However, it is worth noting that every publisher is probably going to have a slightly different variance. Generally, they're the same, but likely you may see something about length as that variant piece. For now, though, let's dive into some of the basics. First and foremost, the vast majority of these points assume the use of Word, and that's the Microsoft Office processing program, Word. At this point, it has become the industry standard. Often, publishers will ask for files with the format of .docx or .pdf. For you self-publishers, Amazon has similar requests, though they do have their own file type, which is a different episode. .docx is the newest file format for Word. I say newest or latest, despite the fact that Microsoft switched from the .doc format to .docx in 2007, but it's remained the standard since. The only other file type that a publisher might accept is an EPUB file, but that's really publish ready, not submission ready. On to the base guidelines themselves. First up is page size, and you're going to want to use either standard lettered size, which is 8.5 by 11, or the A4 paper stock size. Now, according to Word, these are two different sizes. As I said, 8.5 by 11 is considered letter size, but the dimensions of A4 are 8.25 by 11.69, slightly narrower and slightly longer than letter. I've seen several places out there that say A4 is an acceptable size, but letter or 8.5 by 11 is fairly standard, and you can't go wrong using it. Next up is font and size. And size is the easier of the two. 12 point. That's it. In your word processor program, it should have a font size option. Set it to 12 and you're done. 12-point font is the universally standard font size. As for font type, we get a little variation. The goal, however, is something that looks professional. So what are the choices? Well, you're primarily looking at the serif family of fonts. These date back to the very first typeset printers, and the family is called this because they contain a serif. That is a small line or stroke at the end of a big line on each letter. Take a look at the capital A. See the flat line at the bottom of the support legs? That's the serif. And the fonts that are included in this family are Garamond, Bookman, Baskerville, Georgia, and the most well-known, Times New Roman. While I do understand the desire to spice things up with a different choice. These fonts are the ones that look the most professional, and that's because they're based on traditional and original typesetting. So do yourself a favor and stick with the serif family. Now for titles and chapter headings, that's a different story. These days, it's a little more acceptable to have a different choice in those. But for the text itself, stick with serifs. Another big point to remember is to begin each chapter on a new page. This, like the 12-point font, is industry standard. And the easiest way to accomplish this is when you reach the end of a chapter, go to Insert and hit Add Page Break. This ensures that the next chapter begins on its own page. And by using the page break method, you don't have to worry about hitting Enter too many times. What can end up happening if you use that method is when the book reformats for publishing or digital distribution, you may wind up with too many or too few, and the chapter break just won't look right. Now, formatting the page itself begins with the margins, and the industry standard here is 1 inch. That's 2.54 centimeters for you metric folk. And just to be clear, a prose page should have 1 inch margins on all sides. That's top, bottom, left, and right. Now, if you intend to print as opposed to digitally release, you also need to think about bleed, or the book's gutter. This is the area that must be left blank so that the pages can be glued together. And for every 150 pages, you need to increase the gutter size by 0.125 inches, starting with 0.375 for the first 150 pages. But again, gutters are only important if you intend to print, and possibly something that you specifically don't need to worry about if you're using a major publishing house, because once you submit, they will sometimes do the formatting for you. This ensures that your book falls in line with their standards, which means if you are doing that, they will insert the proper gutter size before sending it off to the printer. The next point is line spacing. Now, here's where we see a few different methods. When you submit, the vast majority of publishers would like to see double spacing. This allows easier reading, but also allows easier editing and notations. However, the publish-ready document is single-spaced. So a good practice would be to write it how you want it to appear as a finished product, hence single-spaced. Converting the document to double-spaced for submission really just takes a few clicks of the mouse. Now, I myself use a variation of the single-spaced. Word allows you to enter a custom size. Mine is 1.08, just slightly wider than single-spaced. Doing so allows for just that slightly bigger gap between the lines, making them easier to read. Additionally, there's the space between paragraphs. This too has some variation. The standard is 0 point between paragraphs. However, just like spacing, I tend to set mine just a hint wider at 6 point or 8 point. And while it might not be very large, it is in fact the smallest setting that Word allows. But what it does do is, just like the lines, creates a little separation and allows for an easier time reading. Now, if a publisher has specific requirements for spacing, follow those. Otherwise, you can go with 0 point or 6 point, but don't go above 8. That creates too much of a gap and just feels awkward. Now for a big point of discussion, that is page justification. There are several sources out there that will say left justified or left aligned. This means that the left margin is perfectly aligned. Everything but the indent is flush. However, left aligned creates rags on the right side. And rag is probably exactly what it sounds like. It's the term for unaligned lines. They just look ragged. To avoid having rags, set your document to full justified. What this does is create blocks of text. Both the left and right margins will be perfectly aligned. Now, you might wind up with hyphens with full justified, but the text itself reads better and looks more professional. Now, if you find a program creates large gaps between words because of justified, the only real solution that I've found is more text. What ends up happening is the justified overwrites everything. So every line must be justified on both sides. If the words don't fit, the program makes the line fit. Unfortunately, what this can mean is that there can be gaps between words in a shorter sentence or in any sentence. The program will do its best to make things line up properly. But if it can't do that, then it just stretches the sentence. And while you may have single spaces between words, it looks like 5 or 6 have suddenly appeared. And as I said, the only way to solve this is to add more words. Plug those gaps. I mentioned indents, so let's go to them next. The standard for indents is either 0.3 or 0.5 inches. Of course, to quickly indent, all you really need to do is hit Tab on your keyboard. But this has fallen out of favor with a lot of people. Why? Because when you hit Tab, it may have a longer gap than what is the industry standard. To find out if this is so with your program or your keyboard, there is a test that you can run. The majority of word processors have a page ruler option. Turn this on and count the number of dashes that a tab indent jumps. Is it the standard size? If not, there's an easy fix for that. In the paragraph options, there is a marker for indent size. And all you have to do is tell the program to indent at either 0.3 or 0.5 inches. And every time you hit enter and start a new line, it will automatically indent the proper size. Now, I've talked about some of the variations that I do as a writer, and here I'll bring up another. Take this scenario. There's a line of dialogue and then narration after. For many, the narration after the dialogue is immediately indented. However, if there is a particularly large section of narration coming up, I use a variant in that the very first line of the narration is not indented. The next begins a new paragraph and is. Now, this is a method that I've seen in a number of traditionally published novels. Is it standard? Probably not. But it is a style choice, and it's one that I like to use. And it has a more pronounced look when the dialogue takes up just a single line of text. What would end up happening there is it would be nothing but indents, and everything would blur together. But with my method, the first line of narration is back on the margin. Once again, this allows for that sense of separation. Another thing to keep in mind is scene divider marks. These show that the story has shifted to a different scene or location within a chapter. And there's 2 options that are most commonly used. That would be an asterisk and a hashtag. Now, this is another place where we can see some slight variance. Let's say you have a time jump, either forward in the story or backwards, like a flashback. Unfortunately, what might end up happening is the scene jump would get lost. So by having a variant for time, you allow for that ease of understanding. And when something like this happens in one of my stories, I use 2 markers instead of 1. And in this scenario, the 2 marks would be for a time jump, either forward or backward, while the single mark would be for something like a space jump, moving locations, where the scene changes, there's a break, but the chapter hasn't ended. By differentiating them in this way, you make it easy for the audience to understand which is which. Unless, of course, that's your goal. But generally speaking, the overall goal here is to have something that is simple and clean. Now, when it comes to submitting, there's a few extra things that you need to do. In either the header or the footer, the very top or very bottom of the document, you should include your name and a page number count. Likely, each publisher will have a different preference as to which. However, for yourself, and especially for digital printing, omit these. The digital book will automatically have page number notes. They might be a little different than standard page numbers, but they still function as such. It's how you return to the place that you left off when you exited the reader. As for title pages, those are fairly straightforward. The title and author name are center aligned. The title font is larger than the author name. This would be something between 28 point and 36 point for the title, and between 20 point and 28 point for your name, with the goal being that your author name stays proportional to the title. You want it to be smaller, but you don't want it to be a wildly different size. If you go through a publisher, they will include a copyright block for you. However, if you're doing all of this yourself, then you're going to need to add one, as well as copyright your book. Now, one cool thing that Word allows is to create and save templates. What this means is you create a new document, usually between 2 and 5 pages, including a title page. From there, you go through and set up all of the notations that we've talked about. How the title page looks, where all the indents are, what the sizes are, what the margins are. You can use this template to select everything. And once you're ready to start a new book or your first book, you just load up the template and you're ready to go. And every choice that we've talked about, every formatting option that is ahead of you will be ready and waiting. All of it right to industry standards. In the next episode, as I said, we will go over implementing all of this information. I'll take you into Word and walk you through making all of these choices. And you'll be able to see exactly what some of these differences are. Until then, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.